Welcome to Know This Live. I'm Zincle Esamwa. Dr. Rebecca Hall is a lawyer, historian, and an author who has worked to combat racial injustices of today while also uncovering the untold stories of Black people throughout our nation's history. Her latest book is a graphic novel called Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. Dr. Hall joins me now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, and I wanted to jump in with the title of the book, and I should say it's incredibly powerful. I really was captivated reading it. And in speaking
Thank
about
you.
your writing, yes, of course. In speaking about your writing, I know you said, "While the past is gone, we still live in its wake," which fittingly
hmm
is a nod to the title. So why name it that, and why write this book now?
Well, the word wake has multiple valences. One is, like, as you pointed out, that we live in the wake of slavery, that we live in the wake of slavery and its afterlife. Another is the wake, like a wake of a slave ship. And another meaning is a wake to honor the dead. And so all of those meanings um, were what I was trying to get at with the title of the book. Um, yeah,
Yeah, and I know that at the heart of this graphic novel is enslaved women who fought back throughout the history of the transatlantic slave trade. And that's a story that's not often told. So, why did you feel so compelled to share it and research?
yeah. So yeah, it's not often that a person takes their dissertation and publish uh, scholarly articles and turn it into a graphic novel. But I wanted to get the information from behind the academic curtain, as it were, and where maybe 10 people have read it, and get it out into the mainstream. So that's why I was motivated to, to do this. Um, my my research when I was getting my PhD was on women in slave revolt because I was studying slavery, especially its you know, early formations of slavery, chattel slavery in British America, in the Atlantic world, and I learned that it's not a good mental health formula to study slavery and not and not study slave resistance. And I've always been interested in the history of slave revolt. So when I was working on a topic uh, for my dissertation, I kept reading all these articles and books on slave revolts, and they kept saying, like, within the first 45 pages, they're saying, of course, women weren't involved in this type of resistance, um, these coordinated acts of violent resistance. And I was just wondering, that's like waving a red flag in front of a bull for me. I was wondering, like, why do people keep saying this? What's really going on? And then when I looked at the primary sources, I was finding women in the primary sources. So it ended up being a whole process of, excavating these women, so we could honor their agency, but also looking at what were the factors involved in keeping this history hidden.
And
Yeah.
in your book, you highlight the reality that a lot of slave revolts that occurred, there was a correlation between revolts happening and women being on ships. Why? What's the reason in your assessment?
Right. Yeah, that's the sections that deal with the Atlantic slave trade in particular. In the 18th century, which was something that the British were in charge of at that time. And um, this was based on the work of many historians, quantitative historians who did their work before me, where they put over 35,000 slave ship voyages in a database that could be searched and queried. And they found that there was a revolt on 1 in 10 ships, which surprised people that there were that many revolts on slave ships. And then when they tried to look at what was different between ships that had revolts and ships that didn't have revolts, the only thing that was different was there were more women on the ships that had revolts. But then they immediately dismissed this claim, saying, but we know women weren't involved in this type of resistance. So I went to London and spent months reading slave ship captains' logs. And there are women documented involved in revolt. And the reason why is because after a ship left the coast of Africa, the procedure was to unchain women and bring them on board deck. So they had much more mobility and they were closer to the weapons, and we need to understand that this was a business practice. It was regulated. And this was part of how the business practice worked.
And it's interesting to me that beyond the history that you so thoroughly document, you also talk about the resistance and the struggles you faced in trying to obtain these files and get these facts and statistics. So I wonder, why do you think there was so much resistance to you accessing documents? And you detail that in your book. But also, just overall, why do we have an incomplete picture of these histories around Black people and Black women?
Mhm.
I think about the current dialogues happening about critical race theory and whether or not it should be taught in schools. What's
Yes.
your take?
On which part of it? the
No, of course.
um,
Oh, I think mainly being, why don't we have a comprehensive view of our history when it comes to slavery,
right.
and why do you think there was so much resistance from institutions?
Yeah. So we don't have a comprehensive view of our history of slavery, um, primarily because history is so poorly taught in this country. And for a long time, the historians who were tasked with writing history uh, believed that slavery was a benign institution. And it wasn't until you got until the 60s and 70s that you started to see a reclamation of slave resistance. But the bottom line is that if the people keeping the chronicles and the records don't think that a person's feelings or beliefs or what they care about is worth chronicling, they're not going to chronicle them. And it's not even a conscious decision. It's just this isn't information. It's literally not information. So we are not information.
And obviously, a lot of this information is heavy. You referenced mental health as you're working on a lot of this. Why a graphic novel? A lot of the graphics were really powerful and compelling. I know that they were by Hugo Martinez.
Yes,
Why use that creative process? And what was the process like?
right. So I've always been drawn to graphic novels. I'm a little kind of geeky that way. I've also was particularly inspired by Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Mouse, My Father Bleeds History. Um, so I've been drawn to this medium. And what I learned about this medium um, in the process of creating this and leading up to making a decision to create it in the form of a graphic novel is that it is a unique medium that can do things that others, that can't be done in just regular books. There's this way in which you can play with temporality, which is so crucial, which is like a center point of this book, so that past and present are just rubbing up against each other constantly. And you can do that with a combination of linear text and all at once art. Um, and some people think of this medium as kind of like a dumbing down, but it really is not. You know, um, but it does. I do hope it'll make it more accessible.
And I know part of the story is not just the history, but also your personal story. You share that you're the
Yeah.
granddaughter of slaves. What was going through your mind as you researched and you wrote, and why insert yourself in this book?
Yeah, that was not the plan. As I was writing it, I realized I needed myself as a narrator to sort of hold the pieces together. Um, and because they're so fragmentary, and that's part of the drawback of doing this kind of research. Um, and then it made sense for me to tell stories about what my research process was. And then before I knew it, I was writing something that was part memoir. And yeah, it was not planned.
Well, Dr. Rebecca Hall, thank you so much for being here and sharing your work with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course, and thanks to everyone for watching. This has been Know This Live, and I'm Zincle Esamwa.